Hello and welcome everyone. In this podcast we're going to introduce photosynthesis and describe the chloroplast. First, let's start with a working definition of photosynthesis. We can think of it as a series of reactions driven by light that produces organic material, like glucose. And it does this by using carbon dioxide, so from CO2. The tiny molecule that we see of CO2 is what we use to generate these glucose sugars. We could also describe photosynthesis as a reaction. We could say we take 6 CO2s plus 6 waters with solar energy to produce 1 glucose plus 6 oxygens. Now these products of glucose and oxygen, these can then be fed into glycolysis and oxidative phosphorylation. We need the glucose to start glycolysis, and we need oxygen for oxidative phosphorylation, as well as the citric acid cycle. Now, before we move on, let's address the question of what kind of organisms use photosynthesis. So let's write here, photosynthetic organisms. Sometimes we just think about the plants, and certainly plants undergo photosynthesis, so we should include them. But photosynthesis is used by lots of other species as well. And those would include some algae, like the green algae, and some bacteria, cyanobacteria. So as we move forward in our discussion of photosynthesis, these reactions can occur in plants, green algae, and cyanobacteria. But ultimately, everything is dependent upon photosynthesis. Photosynthetic organisms are what we call our primary producers. They generate the sugar that we need and the oxygen we need as you move up the trophic levels. So animals may eat a plant or algae or bacteria. In that process, they will convert these glucose and oxygen molecules into energy. So we're all dependent upon photosynthesis. So now I want to talk about the chloroplast. So let's draw a chloroplast here. They're very similar to mitochondria in some respects, but also different. I'll try to point those out as we move forward. Like the mitochondria, the chloroplast also has 2 membranes. Like the mitochondria, the outer membrane here is very porous. Lots of things can get across the outer membrane. Not everything, but it's much more porous than our inner membrane. And the inner membrane is much more selective about what gets through, just like the inner membrane of the mitochondria. On the inside of the chloroplast is the stroma. The stroma is analogous to the matrix of the mitochondria. They are both a fluid-filled substance within their respective organelles, and they house many metabolic enzymes and pathways. Now, unlike mitochondria, chloroplasts contain an internal membrane structure called the thylakoid. Now, within the thylakoid, these thylakoid membranes will contain the reactions of stage 1 of photosynthesis. Sometimes we call these the light reactions, but we're going to call them stage 1. Stage 1 produces ATP and NADPH, similar to NADH, but not the exact same thing. So NADPH. They make these substances going through these reactions, the stage 1 reactions, using water and sunlight. I should also mention they make oxygen, which is taken out of the chloroplast as well. I wrote these in here because these are going to be used for the next stage of photosynthesis. So let's talk about stage 2. Stage 2 is going to use ATP and NADPH in the stroma to make glucose. So they will make, and I'm going to have it leaving here, sugars like glucose, amino acids, and fatty acids. And they do this by using, in addition to ATP and NADPH, carbon dioxide, which they get from respiration through oxidative phosphorylation and the citric acid cycle. This stage 1 is sometimes called the dark reactions. I'm not a fan of calling these light and dark reactions, but these are terms your book uses. I probably won't use them though. But a better term for this, I think, is calling it the carbon fixation. Because that's what it does. It's going, as we'll see when we talk about it in a little bit more detail, it's going to take these CO2 molecules and fix them, generating these larger carbon-based structures. All right, now there's a couple other things I want to mention to you as we're looking at this picture here that I didn't mention as we were moving forward, but I want to make sure it's clear. This ATP that is produced here also is produced by our ATP synthase that we learned about in the last section. Same enzyme structure, but now it's located in the thylakoid. I also wanted to identify for you stomata, or stoma for singular. These are located along the chloroplast membrane, all over it. And this is how CO2 gets in and oxygen gets out. So I should probably put one around our oxygens and our CO2s, just to keep things legal. So these are stomata. And the last thing I didn't mention that is really important to talk about, and that is chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is found within the chloroplast. This is what makes the plants appear green. Chlorophyll is a light capturing pigment. And we'll talk more about the light capturing pigment when we talk about stage 1 here of photosynthesis. Okay, that's all I have for this podcast. It turns out to be a pretty short podcast. But if you have any questions at all, please let me know. I'll see you in class tomorrow. Bye.